Today, the message is entitled The Revival of Babylon and the Roman Empire. Revival of Babylon and the Roman Empire. In the book of Revelation, Babylon is the center of trade and commerce and government and arts. It's also the center of immorality and godlessness. So we know that Babylon has been a world power. We'll look at that in a minute. Babylon has been a world power. It's been a big area of influence as a world power and a city. But Babylon physically went out of existence hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago. But in the book of Revelation, the book of Revelation calls Mystery Babylon is in operation. And many people have wondered, well, what's Mystery Babylon? Is it actually, is like Babylon going to be another world power? What's this whole Babylon thing with the end times? Because certainly when you read Revelation, it's in operation, because at the end of Revelation, they're celebrating because Babylon has fallen, which is a good thing, right? But that means it has risen up to be a big thing. And so prophecy tells us that Babylon, or Mystery Babylon, is going to be at the return of Jesus. And not only that, but prophecy in Daniel, which is in the Old Testament, places what most believe, and I'm going to show you today why I strongly believe that, Europe as the world power when Jesus returns. So if Babylon's the world power when Jesus returns, and Europe is a world power, how can that both be true? I think I'm going to show you that today. I'm going to show you biblical prophecy, which is God's word, so that's true. Understanding that how different people interpret that prophecy may be different, right? And that's always the way, all the Bible's that way, is like, how do we interpret the truth of the Bible? And sometimes we get the interpretation probably pretty right. Maybe sometimes not as much. And so I'm admitting to you today as we start that there is some opinion, some speculation, and there's some interpretation that could be open to differences, all right? I understand that. But I think what I'm going to show you today is pretty convincing about what's happening right now in our world. And the reason we're talking about that, and today it's going to get kind of dark. We're not talking about that to bum people out. We're not glorifying darkness. We're telling you this because as you see things happen, you can have an understanding why it's happening, what's going on, and how do we respond to that. And so we're not just giving information to give information. We're giving information so that as you see these things unfold, that you don't have to have fear and anxiety. You can know exactly what's going on. And so I'm just going to start out and tell you what the main point is today, and then we're going to talk about it. So here it is. The European Union, with the spirit of Babylon, will be the world power when Jesus returns. Again, that's an interpretation based on prophecy. I'm going to show you, again, I believe, how do we get that? So we have to go back to the origins of Babylon. That's where we're going to start, which is the Tower of Babel. Babylon gets its name from Babel, the Tower of Babel. Many of you are familiar with that story. Let me just read, one verse to you out of Genesis 11, chapter 11, verse 4. And they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let's make a name for ourselves." So this is after the flood. These are Noah's descendants. Nimrod was supposedly the main builder of this. And they wanted to build this huge tower up into the heavens. They wanted to ascend to heaven. They were looking for a heavenly connection apart from God the Father, all right? They were looking for human ascension. That's what was going on, and that's why God ultimately destroyed the tower. Now, we don't have a photograph of the Tower of Babel because they didn't have the iPhone 11 then. They only had the 5, and it didn't take very good pictures. So, but based on biblical accounts and historical accounts of the Tower of Babel, which was a real building, there's been many paintings. One of the most famous painting, we're going to show a picture of it now. This was from Peter Bruegel, I think is how you say his name. He's a Dutch artist, very famous. He painted this in 1563, and this is his rendition of the Tower of Babel. And you can see that it's not finished. All right, it's wide at the bottom and gets narrower, and the Bible talks about that, and it's kind of got this spiral sort of concourse to get up to the top. But you can see it never got finished because God destroyed it before it got finished. He was really stamping out man's rebellion. Again, they were trying to ascend into heaven apart from God. That's a real spirit of rebellion. It's a spirit of Satan. Lucifer had the same attitude. And in fact, Isaiah 14 talks about that. It's talking about people and their desire to ascend without God, but it also is talking really specifically about Lucifer. Isaiah 14 verse 13 says, "But you said in your heart," speaking to Lucifer, but it's also that spirit to people who want to ascend without God, "I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will make myself like the Most High." That's what Lucifer wanted to do, attempted to do, and he led a rebellion so that could happen. That's why he got kicked out of heaven. The Bible would lead us to believe that a third of the angels followed him in that rebellion. But that was his thing. I want to ascend. I want to be where God is, but I want to be the man. People throughout history have been the same, many, not all, have had that same attitude. It's like, I want the benefits of heaven. I want to be top of the food chain, but I don't really want to do the whole God thing. I want to do it on my own. So since the time of the Tower of Babel, well, really, since the Garden of Eden, to be honest, but especially since the time of Babel and subsequently Babylon, Babylon has become a symbol of rebellion. So when we talk about the spirit of Babylon, we're really talking about a spirit of rebellion, a spirit of anti-God. It's not really an indifference to God, it's almost like an anti-God. Like, I don't want that, but I want to ascend. I want that heaven thing. It's interesting, this is a side note, that when God's people rebelled, a couple thousand years, I don't know, 1,000, maybe 1,000 years, whenever it was, after the Tower of Babel fell, and God said, because of your disobedience, I'm going to send you into captivity for 70 years. Where did he send them? You can answer, it's not a trick question. Babylon. So the symbol, the city, or it was not just a city then, it was a whole world power, but this country of Babylon, which symbolizes rebellion, is the very country God sent his people into captivity. Isn't that kind of interesting? Interesting side note. So here's a sub-point under there if you're keeping track on your iPhone or your bulletin. The spirit of Babylon, then, is one of rebellion against God. So when we talk about the spirit of Babylon, that's what we're really talking about. It's like this anti-God, rebellion against God, glorification of man, like man's the man, I'm the man. So, from the Tower of Babel, now let's fast forward to between 500 and 600 BC. All right, so about 2,500, 2,600 years ago. Babylon is now the world power. The Tower of Babel, maybe it was a world power then, but I don't know, the world was pretty small. But 500, 600 BC, Babylon is the world power. And their king, at this time that we're going to talk about, is Nebuchadnezzar. Now, there was a Nebuchadnezzar Senior. This is Nebuchadnezzar Junior. And he was thinking like kind of he was God. Like, he was pretty powerful. Like, he was top of the food chain. If you read about Nebuchadnezzar at the very end of his life, he puts his faith in God. But most of his life, he was anti-God and rebellious towards God. And so while the people were in captivity, God's people were in captivity, he took the best and brightest of Israel, of God's people, and brought them into his court to serve him. And one of those guys was Daniel. That's how Daniel ended up there. Actually, Daniel, for all we know, probably he died in that land. And he was prophetic. God showed him stuff. God protected him. He was an amazing man, and he never caved in on his faith, even with threats of death. He always faithfully served God. And so while it probably relatively new in Nebuchadnezzar's inner circle, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And it was a troubling dream. He woke up and he knew he was troubled. He knew he had a dream and he knew he was troubled, but he couldn't really remember the dream. Like, oh, what was that dream? I know it was significant. And it's troubling me because I can't remember it. And so he calls in his wise men, all his prophets. Now, at that time, most of his prophets were pagan and tapped into the dark side, all right? They had some power, but it was a demonic power. It was the same power that the Pharaoh used to, turn staffs into snakes and all that stuff. So he's saying, hey, wise men, prophets, seers, I had a dream, and I can't remember it, and I need to know it because it's important, and I need you to tell me the dream and interpret it. And they're like, all of them said, if you tell us the dream, we'll interpret it. He goes, no, if you're all that, if you're like the supernatural seers that you say you are, you should be able to tell me what my dream is. Tell me what my dream is and then interpret it. And they're like, you tell us and we'll interpret it. And it went back and forth. And he's like, you guys are worthless. What do I have you around for? And he put out an order that all his prophets would be killed. All these wise men, all be killed, including Daniel and that whole crew. Well, Daniel wasn't in on that original conversation, but word got to him, and he goes, I can tell him what the dream is. Because he didn't probably know at that time, but he knew God could tell him. And so he took a bold step to, I'll tell him. And so Daniel, just before all of them are killed, is rushed in to the king's inner circle, and he tells him what he dreamed. Dreamt, whatever. And then he gives the interpretation. So let me just read that to you. Daniel chapter 2, starting in verse 31. You can tell him what the dream is. You, O king, were watching, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary radiance, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of the statue was made of fine gold, its chest and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued watching until a stone was broken off without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed to pieces all at the same time. And they were like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the entire earth. Now, down to verse 40. There'll be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron. Just as the iron smashes and crushes everything, so like iron that crushes, it will smash and crush all these things. And in that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom. But it will have within it some of the toughness of iron, since you saw the iron mixed with common clay. All right, this is a really significant dream and interpretation, and I'm going to explain what that meant. So if you want to put that picture up of the statue, that's an artist rendition of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream. And what it was is it represents 4 world powers, and a 5th to come, but 4 world powers that have been in existence. And the gold represented, this is what Daniel, we're not guessing at this, Daniel told him this. The gold represented the current world power of Babylon, which was Nebuchadnezzar. And so that was in existence at that time. So everything from there was after that was prophetic. The arms of breast and arms of silver was the next world power, which was Greece. And I don't have time to go into all these nations, and these metals are very significant, all right? So that's how we know. So the next world power was, not Greece, Medo-Persia. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead. Persia, which is modern-day Iran, but it was Medo-Persia. It was kind of these two that came together, and you have the 2 arms, right? The breast with the 2 arms, Medo-Persia. That was the next world power. King Cyrus was king of Medo-Persia. You've heard a lot about Cyrus. After Medo-Persia, the next world power was Greece. That's the bronze. After Greece, the next world power, and that was the world power that when Jesus was born, was Rome. That's the 2 iron legs. Right? So those are the world powers that Daniel was shown, that Nebuchadnezzar was shown, but Daniel prophesied these are the world powers to come. It probably didn't mean a lot to a lot of people, but it means a lot to us today, especially as we talk about that stone that comes and hits the toes of iron and clay. And that's where we're going to go. But let's go to the Roman Empire. 2 legs of iron. Iron and Rome was compared to iron a lot because iron is strong and just smashes stuff. And when Rome came to power, they just smashed stuff. I mean, literally and figuratively. And so they were that iron world power. But a lot of people don't know that Rome eventually became 2 sections, the Roman Empire. At 285 AD. They started in about Roman Empire started, 149, 117 BC, 100 years before Christ. 300 years after Christ, the Roman Empire splits into 2 sections, east and west. In 330 AD, the emperor of the Roman Empire, Constantine, moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, Turkey. It's now Istanbul, Turkey. So for hundreds and hundreds of years, the capital of the Roman Empire was Turkey, Istanbul, now Constantinople then. So this 2 legs was like, okay, there's 2 sections of the Roman Empire. All right, so that makes the 2 legs make a lot of sense, right? So that the western part of the Roman Empire fell, 400 and something AD, kind of. The Eastern Empire didn't fall till in the 1400s. So they went almost to the time of Columbus as there was a Roman Empire. But if you go to the west, go back to the west, the Holy Roman Empire, ever heard of the Holy Roman Empire? That started about 800 AD, and that was kind of a weird mix of like the Catholic Church and the Pope and the kings of Europe. King Charlemagne was the first. Actually, the Pope Leo II, anointed King Charlemagne, who was actually from Germany. So the Holy Roman Empire, which went from 800 AD to actually, literally, to 1800s, was the Holy Roman Empire was in effect. It was this sort of church pope thing, leader of Europe thing in cahoots. And it was a really uncomfortable union, like politics and religion. But the church knew they needed the government for their protection and to grow, and the government knew they needed the church's stamp of approval, so they kind of had this, they were kind of weird bed partners. And that went from 800 to 1800, to the time of Napoleon. I guess what I'm trying to say, there was some form of the Roman Empire from 27 BC or 100 BC, whenever you count it, up to the 1800s. For almost 2,000 years, there was some form of the Roman Empire. It lasted a lot longer than we think, some form of it. Okay, so we know that was a big deal, right? And it looks like those legs of iron, okay, that was a pretty accurate prophetic picture of the Roman Empire. So now we're going to talk about the revived Roman Empire. We're going to move down to the feet of iron and clay. Daniel 2, verse 42. And just as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong and part of it will be fragile. In that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in their descendants, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron is not combined with pottery. So in that statue and in this prophecy, we see the feet had iron and clay. And like Daniel says, yeah, those don't stick together. You don't weld those. It's not stable. But iron's pretty strong. So there's a lot of strength here, but there's also a fragility. And he's talking about a world power yet to come. All right, so this is the world power that's going to be on the earth when Jesus comes back. I'll show you that in a minute, but just let's put up a map there, just so you kind of see where this is a map of the Roman Empire. It includes almost all of Europe, over to Turkey, which is, it says Asia Minor. Asia Minor. You read a lot about Asia Minor. Sounds like I'm from Massachusetts. Asia Minor. Asia Minor in the Bible, which is really Turkey and some other areas. And then it goes around, it almost touches the tip of Iraq, and then comes around across northern Africa. That's the Roman Empire back then. And so we talk about this revived Roman Empire because that's what Daniel saw. It's like, okay, so he says the descendants of this empire are going to be part of this empire of the toes of clay and iron. So when I say descendants, the people that live there in that empire, that's going to be the same empire in the last time. It's just going to be different. It's going to be a mixture that's kind of powerful, but kind of fragile. So we've seen that. Europe, for thousands of years, were tribes. You had the Germanic tribe and all these different tribes. Curiously, at the time of the Roman Empire, there was actually 10 tribes in this area. 3 are no longer there. But Europeans had this desire to come together as a stronger nation. They saw that the United States had become a world power. The Soviets had become a world power. Germany, who was a world power, had lost 2 wars, and they were licking their wounds. And so Europe was like, how can we be somebody? We're getting left behind. And so they began attempts to come together, and it started out economically. They started the European Economic Union. And the whole idea is they wanted to make sort of this United States of Europe. In fact, they wanted to call it that for a while, but they didn't because that name was already taken. But it started with the Treaty of Rome in March 25th of 1957, European Economic Union. That was actually signed in Rome, by the way. The EU became official, the European Union became an official union of countries in 1993. They made it official. In 2002, the European Union started circulating its own currency. So in 2002, you could actually get a euro. You probably euro was your money in Spain. And you get euros when you fly through Germany. In 2007, the European Union made a position of president. So in 2007, the European Union got a president. So now they have a union, a state, a United States, of nations, excuse me. They have a common currency, and now they have a president by 2007. Does that look kind of like a revived Roman Empire? It kind of does. I mean, they're missing a few countries there, like the very top of northern Africa, but it's there. Daniel said this iron and clay mixture in these toes. So the iron, we know, it says it's the descendants of the Roman Empire, right? So we know it's this area. It's going to be fragile. Ever heard of Brexit? It wasn't that many years ago when the United Kingdom said, we don't like the European Union. They're bossy. We want to go back to our own sovereignty. And so they started what they called an exit out of the European Union, which they voted on and kind of have done, but it became known as Brexit because the British exit, Brexit. And now they're like trying to be wooed back in, and other countries like, well, we might want to leave. No, you need to stay, we need you. And so they're really working hard to keep everybody together in this revived Roman Empire that they call the European Union. And that's this sort of fragility. And it was a couple of years ago, they talked about having their own army. Now there's NATO forces in Europe, but they're talking like, no, we want our own EU army. And France is really behind this. And that's on the moves. Like the European Union does not have their own army. They kind of use NATO forces and UN forces, but they're working on, and they're probably further down the road than I'm even reporting, on having their own army. We talked about this weird mixture of iron and clay. Europe is being overwhelmed by Muslim immigration. The Muslims are moving into Europe at exponential rates, especially into Germany. They've kind of had open borders because they're very progressive, liberal over there. Like, hey, we have open borders, but now they're like kind of rethinking that. Because now there are certain cities in Europe where they're trying to implement Sharia law because the majority of the population is Muslim. Fragile. It's this mixture of iron and clay. By the way, in that Roman Empire, the red you see on the map there, all along northern Africa and around Turkey, those are all Muslim nations. Turkey has gotten very, very Muslim. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. Turkey used to be, well, they've always had Muslims and a lot of Muslims, but they were always very friendly to the Christians and to the Jews. Not so much anymore. They're turning more militant Muslim all the time. So we've got this Muslim influence in Europe, in the revived Roman Empire. We've got people who kind of want to be together, but who kind of don't. We've got a common currency, we've got a common president, we have a parliament, and they're working to be a world power, and they're well on their way, but it's fragile. Again, I think Daniel did a really good explaining what we're seeing right now. And this whole Brexit thing and this whole fragile thing we really didn't see until the last few years. So that's what I'm trying to say. In these last few years, we're seeing more prophetic things begin to happen, especially in the revived Roman Empire. So, I, along with a lot of people who study the Bible a lot and study prophecy, interpret Daniel's prophecy that the feet of iron and clay is a revived Roman Empire. It says the descendants of them. And it even explains what's going on there now. Now, if there's other explanations of where this end time, what nation the feet and toes are, I'm open to it. But man, does it look like it's Europe, right? It's like I don't know how you would put anything else there. So, but I also so at the end times, European Union will be the world power, but also we talked about the spirit of Babylon. Babylon, as we said earlier, is an illustration, a representation of rebellion to God, right? Really anti-God. This is going to be a bold statement. And I didn't even have a clue about this until this last week as I've been studying this, because there's tons of information right out in the open. Europe has been importing Babylon into Europe for decades. Literally and figuratively. Put up the next picture, please. This is an artist's rendition of an actual temple that existed in the Bible. We call it Pergamon. In other languages, it's Pergamon. Same thing. It's called the Temple of Zeus. Without trying to go into all the mythology stuff, Zeus is basically a counterfeit of Father God. Zeus is the father of all that pagan stuff. Everything that Satan does is a counterfeit. Everything. To the Trinity, to everything, all right? Salvation, he has a counterfeit salvation, he has a counterfeit Trinity, he does counterfeit signs and wonders, and I think sometimes he just does things to mock God. And so this temple that really existed, and parts of it still exist today, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. The Temple of Zeus was in what they call now Pergamon. The Bible called Pergamon. All right, and that's where it was the altar of Zeus. Also had the gate of Ishtar. Ishtar was a sexual goddess. And in the Bible, when they talked about the Asherah poles, which were basically phallic symbols of sexual immorality, that's Ishtar. Asherah, Ishtar, same person. It's totally demonic stuff. So, let me read what Jesus said. Revelation chapter 2. Remember, this is in Pergamon, right? Revelation chapter 2, verse 12 and 13, Jesus says, he's telling John to write letters to these churches. And to the angel of the church in Pergamon. What's in Pergamon? Altar of Zeus. Write, the one who has the sharp two-edged sword says this, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. And he goes on to talk about Pergamum being the actual seat of Satan. Like Satan, like we think he's all over, he's not omnipresent. Satan can be at one place at one time. And Jesus says, he points to Pergamum because there were Christians there. And like, good job, Christians, for not caving in. Now, a few of them did, and that's why he was writing that letter, but a lot of them didn't. But he said, I know where you dwell. You dwell right where Satan dwells. Where does Satan dwell? Altar of Zeus. Right? I mean, he can go wherever he wants, but Jesus said, that's the seat of Satan. Okay. Go ahead. A couple thousand years. It's the 1930s. Hitler has a dream to restore Babylon in Germany. And he talked about it a lot. And Hitler, along with other people, worked hard because there were lots of remains in Pergamon, which is in Turkey, by the way, or Pergamon. There were lots of remains of the Temple of Zeus. There was lots still there. I mean, a lot of it had crumbled down, but a lot was still there. And Germany said, let's go get that. Let's get that, and we'll rebuild it in Germany. And they've made a museum. There's actually in Germany a museum that's pretty famous, although I'd never heard of it until I started researching. But they have hundreds of thousands of visitors every year, called the Museum of Pergamon. In the Museum of Pergamon is kind of a replication, but also a restoration of the Altar of Zeus in Berlin, Germany, the seat of Satan. It's like, and I don't know what was going through people's minds. I know who was influencing them. I know 100% who that was. But it was like, I got a great idea. Let's go to Turkey and bring back the altar of Zeus and rebuild it. What a great idea. And they did. And this is it. It's there. It's closed right now because they're renovating, because it's been there since the 30s. They started building it. But it's soon to be open. You can go on, I'm telling you, this is not internet lore. This is not Photoshop stuff. You go to Museum of Pergamon, and you can take the virtual tour and Altar of Zeus. They don't call it the seat of Satan, but that's what Jesus called it. Did he not? He did. Nobody's saying, hey, come to Berlin and see the seat of Satan. And it wasn't like somebody said, hey, we got all these ruins. Anybody want them? Oh, Germany, we'll take them. No, they went they wanted it. And now there's some pushback, hey, that belonged to Turkey. Maybe Turkey wants it. Yeah, we want it. And in the 50s, the Soviet Union wanted it. There's this fight over this altar that's the seat of Satan. And Berlin says, no, it's ours, and we're keeping it. All right. All I'm telling you is Europe, this is proof, brought the seat of Satan into Germany. All right. We got to move on. Go back to that. Do the painting. I think it's the next picture. Okay. Remember this painting of the Tower of Babel that I showed you earlier? Again, it's an artist's rendition, right? What does Babel and Babylon represent? Rebellion to God. Man, we're going to do it ourselves. So I said that the European Union formed officially in 1993. It had been a lot of years working up to that. 2002, they got their own president, and they got their own currency. In December of 1999, they finished their own parliament building in Strasbourg, France. All right, look at this picture closely right here. Don't switch it yet. Oh, well, you did, okay. Now look at that picture. That's the parliament building in Strasbourg, France. Does that remind you of anything? It's purposefully unfinished. And it's unapologetically designed after that painting, the Tower of Babel. It wasn't like, oh, really? What a coincidence. It's like, no, we designed it that way. What? Let's come together as a world power, and in our parliament building, let's design it as a symbol to rebellion to God. Again, probably nobody verbalized that, and I would guess the vast majority didn't even see that, but I know the puppet master, who's Satan himself, is pulling all the strings. Here's a great idea. Bring the seat of Satan to Europe. Build your government building to look like the Tower of Babel, to put it right in God's face. I mean, can you, is it, I know this feels kind of yucky, but I'm just telling you, it's hidden in plain sight. I was talking to Bob and Janice the other night. I'm like, these things, I never knew this, But when you look at it, it's like, it's right there. You don't have to look hard to find this stuff. And it's not like the Europeans are going, oh, it's not that. It's like, at the very top, they're like, well, whatever. All right. So, Europe, ever wonder how they got its name? There was a princess, this is mythology. Princess, and mythology has its roots in the demonic, because there was a lot of probably mythology things that kind of happened. That's all a counterfeit to God's kingdom. I'm not saying all this happened, but the mythology is a pagan explanation of things, okay? All right, good. So Europa is this beautiful young princess, and she's out picking flowers. And Zeus, right, father, the counterfeit of Father God, sees Europa and how beautiful she is. So he morphs himself into a beast, a bull, this beautiful beast, and he trots by Europa, and she thinks he's so beautiful, she jumps on his back, grabs onto his horns, and he takes off with her. And this is, I'm not paraphrasing, he rapes her. And she has 3 children who are judges in the underworld. So even in mythology, it's like, yeah, her children are bigwigs in the underworld. That's their mythology. That's Europa. Oh, how about let's name our country after her? Or our continent, whatever. Okay, that's kind of weird. So this is Zeus. Remember, we got the Zeus tie-in, right? Altar of Zeus. Now we got Europa. Of course, Europa, that name's been around for a long time. So, let me read this. Okay, I'm going as fast as I can. Are you hanging with me? Because there's a few more things here. Might be a little late, but there's no football, so we're okay. Revelation 17, starting in verse 3. John says, and talking about the Spirit, he's seeing things in heaven, and he carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. That's those toes and the kings of Europe. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold, precious stones, pearls, holding in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth. So we know that there's a lot more about Babylon in Revelation, but it's like, here's the symbol of Babylon, what they call Mystery Babylon, which means it's probably not in the same location, but there's still the spirit of Babylon. Here's what Babylon looked like to me, John says. It looked like a woman riding on a beast. Isn't that what it says here? So here's a statue, a picture of a statue all over Europe. This is out in front of their main office in Brussels. Woman on a beast. And that artwork is all over Europe, but especially in their government buildings. A woman on a beast. Now, it might not be the woman here. Well, maybe not, but everything else we're seeing seems to be sure like a mockery in God's face. And when John is saying, I'm seeing stuff, and I'm seeing in this end time stuff, I'm seeing a woman on a beast, and we think, okay, she's right there. It's like, did he see that statue? I mean, what came first, the beast or the statue? You know what? I don't know. It's just curious, at the least. Mystery Babylon is now the unapologetic symbol of the European Union. Just saying. And Europa has been given the title of Queen of Heaven. But there's also another title of Queen of Heaven, Ishtar. Remember I talked about Ishtar or Ashra? And there's, put that next picture up. This is at the Pergamon Museum, the same place where the Altar of Zeus is, the seat of Satan. This is also the gateway to Ishtar. There was a lot of that still left in the original excavation. So not only did we get the Temple of Zeus and a lot of that the actual pieces, this is the gate, Ishtar's gate into sexual immorality and all that. And so they brought that in there. So that's there too. And they have, many of them refer to Ishtar, Asherah, who's the goddess of sex and fertility, as queen of heaven, wife of Baal. Well, Baal also is Satan in the Bible. I'm not going to read it. Jeremiah, if you want to read about the queen of heaven as a bad thing, read Jeremiah 44. There were God's people in rebellion. The women were making sacrifices to the queen of heaven. In the Bible, okay, let me just read this. Revelation 12, verses 1 and 2. John's seen things. He says, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was pregnant and cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. All right, so John is saying, I saw a picture of like Mary and, about to give birth to the Savior, Jesus. All right, and it's like, yeah. And so some people there have been some artist renditions, of Mary with 12 stars around her head, which represent the 12 tribes of Israel. That's where Jesus came out of, right? It's all biblical. And so many Christians refer to Mary, I don't, but many Christians refer to her as the Queen of Heaven. People from on the mythological side refer to Ishtar and these other pagans as Queen of Heaven, all right? So, give me the next photo. This is the EU flag. I'll count the stars for you, there's 12. You've seen that flag, haven't you, Matt and Rachel? Yeah. 12 stars for the Queen of Heaven. And it's not Mary, it's Ishtar, possibly Europa. I mean, it's like every chance they get a chance to take a symbol and mock Jesus or counterfeit it, it's like they've taken that opportunity. It's not one thing, it's not two things, and if we had more time, and I'm already taking more time than I should, I would show you even more. But I'm just like, at some point, enough is enough, right? I mean, you've seen this. I got a few more things. Let me go quickly. I'm not even going to talk about Knights Templar. Well, I have to for a minute, I guess, to show. Knights Templar, okay, back in the late hundreds, 800, 900, a lot of people from Europe would make pilgrimages to Israel, either because they wanted to see the Holy Land or they wanted to go fight in the Crusades, wipe out the Jews and the Muslims. Either way, a lot, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, Europeans walking by foot to Israel, pilgrimage. The Knights Templar, who started out good, they were connected with the church, the Catholic Church, hey, we'll help make sure you get there safely so you can go help fight or, be part of the cause or repopulate this horrible place. And what they actually got into, they got this great idea is hey, all these people have money, but as they're traveling, robbers are mugging them and taking their money and possessions. And they have nothing. They have to turn around and go home or they die or whatever. It's hey, pilgrim in Europe, you give us your money, we'll write out a certificate that says when you get to Jerusalem, our coffers down there will give you that money. They invented the checkbook. That's how it started. They invented central banking. And boy, could I go way off on that, and I'm not going to. I want to. I'm not going to. And they made so much money because there's more than half of the pilgrims died on the way. Never made it. Never made it. Do you think the Knights Templar gave the money back to the family? No. They got filthy, stinking rich. That's what literally started the central bank. They started later loaning money to nations, and again, I can't go there, I don't have time, but whatever. they got really crooked. They got really demonic. They went from being kind of good guys trying to help people and greedy to being evil. And it got so evil that eventually, about 1200, the Pope, who, you guys are getting even too bad for you and us. You can't be a part of us anymore. Because here's one of the things they were doing. They were worshiping a god they called Baphomet, B-A-P-H-O-M-E-T. I don't know if I'm saying that right. And they would require worship of him for you to be a Knights Templar. And you wanted to be a Knights Templar because that's how you got rich. And so they made you worship that image right there. I don't know how well you can see it. It's a man with a goat's head. It's Satan. I mean, just look at it. Is that not Satan? It is. Baphomet. So that happened around 1000 AD-ish. And the Knights Templar got their people, I mean, they were at work in Europe and Jerusalem, but Europe was their place of operation. That's like 1,000 years ago. So 2015 or 16, they opened up a high-speed rail in a tunnel from Switzerland to somewhere. So, I don't know, France or somewhere. 67 kilometers. Do you know what I'm talking about? Does it go to France or do you know? Germany. Anyway, 67 kilometers, it was a big deal. It was a lot of technology. And when it opened in, I think, 2016, like all the dignitaries were there. Angela Merkel was there, and I think Macron from France were riding the train. So all these EU leaders were there. The president of the EU was there. It was a big deal. There was a big celebration. And there was this big, show, like kind of like the Super Bowl Super Bowl halftime or whatever. Here's a picture of the headliner. Baphomet. This is like how Europe's like, EU, here's how we'll celebrate this awesome achievement. Let's have Baphomet come and do a song and dance. And it's exactly what they did. This is not internet lore. Anyone can look this up. And people who don't understand what the whole goat thing is, and man, did you see those dancers? Wasn't that awesome? And the music? I mean, people are just thinking like, this is so awesome. I'm like, you guys, I had no idea this was going on. You probably had no idea this was going on. This is not a conspiracy theory. I'm not really a conspiracy theorist. I just kind of like deal in facts. And what I've presented to you of what's going on there is fact. Now, I will admit that marrying that with the biblical prophecy is open to some interpretation. I will admit that. But to me, man, it looks pretty clear. I'll just state my opinion, but this looks pretty clear. I think I can stand on this pretty hard. Europe has kicked God out, but invited Babylon in. Antichrist spirit is already at work in Europe. Has been for a while. And I believe the stage is being set for the Antichrist in the coming tribulation. And we've not talked a lot about the Antichrist and the tribulation, and we'll talk about that in another message. I'm not saying everyone in Europe is a devil worshiper. I'm not saying that God's work is not being done in Europe. I am not saying that his church is not being built, because it is. There are amazing things going on in God's kingdom in Europe, side by side to some pretty dark things. That's biblical. That's biblical. So what are we supposed to do? I mean, okay, I just give you a lot of information. It's not to freak you out. It's not to bum you out. It's not to, be sensational. It's like, okay, what do we do with this? Like, well, we don't we don't say, well, Europe's gone to hell in a handbasket, there's nothing we can do. It's like, that's not true. And how are we supposed to view that? Well, we got to go to God's word. Isaiah 60, starting verse 1, talking to you as believers. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness will cover the earth, and deep darkness the peoples. That's what we're seeing. We are seeing deep darkness cover the earth and deep darkness cover the people. But that doesn't mean we're covered in darkness. That doesn't mean we run and hide in the darkness. We stand up and we let our light shine. And we are unapologetically part of Christ's kingdom. And we are believing and knowing that God's glory is going to make us shine to people. And certain people are going to be drawn to that. Out of that darkness, people are going to be drawn to that because they're going to see the emptiness of that darkness. And they're going to see the finality of that. Like, where's this going? Nowhere. Now, will there be a lot of people on that darkness train? Yes, there will. The Bible says that. But will there be a radiant bride ready for Christ's return who's building the church? Yes. At the same time, it's not either or. It's both. And we're not going to be bummed out and just closed down like, well, that's the way it's going to go. Nothing I can do to help. That's not true. You're called to stand up and shine your light and let the glory of God fill you and shine. And that's what we're going to do as a church. And that's what we need to do even as a nation and the people who are missionaries and workers and church people in Europe are going to let their light shine, and people are going to respond. They're doing it today, and they'll keep doing it. As darkness deepens, the light gets brighter. You never see a jeweler put diamonds on a white background. Almost never. I mean, when they really want to show them off, it's a black background. Last point, then we're going. Jesus is coming to set up a one-world government that will last forever. Still in Daniel, chapter 2, verse 34. I mean, we've read this before, but I want to reread this. Daniel's talking to Nebuchadnezzar. You continued watching until a stone was broken off without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed to pieces all at the same time. And they were like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the entire earth. Jesus is that stone. Isaiah 8:14, prophesying about Jesus, says, then he, meaning Jesus, will become a sanctuary. But to both houses of Israel, he will be a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and a snare and a trap for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Many will stumble over them. Then they will fall and be broken. They'll be snared and caught. For people who will not acknowledge Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, for people who are anti-God and rebelling against him, Jesus is going to be a stumbling stone for them. It's going to be that rock coming down and smashing that, and everything that man has built is going to crumble. And nothing of man will remain. All that man has tried to build up, to ascend apart from God, will be destroyed. 1 Peter 2, verses 4 and 5. As you come to him, meaning you as believers, the living stone, that's Jesus, rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him. You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. When Jesus comes back to earth, we'll be with him. And he's going to crush the ungodly powers that have been set up on this earth, and he's going to set up his kingdom, and we're going to be part of that. We're going to be with him. Jesus is bringing his church back with him when he comes back. We're a part of that. If you believe in Jesus Christ, that makes you part of the church. So he's the cornerstone, but we're the living stones. We're not the ones that crushes their feet necessarily, but we're part of it because we're with the cornerstone. We're built in that same building. Daniel 2:44. And in the days of those kings, what kings? The kings that we're talking about that are just being set up now, the kings with the iron and the clay toes, right? The kings of the last days. In those days, the kings of God of heaven, in those days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it itself will endure forever. And then finally, one last verse, Acts 4:11. Jesus is the stone you builders rejected, but has become the cornerstone. Here's the bottom line. Jesus is either your stumbling stone or your cornerstone. When he comes back, there's no in between. If he's your cornerstone, you're with him and you're in good shape and you have nothing to worry about. No matter what you see in these days, you have nothing to fear. He's with you. We're going to see some weird things and we're going to see fearful things, but we're not going to let fear impact us because Jesus is our cornerstone and we're with him. The reason for all this information is not to create fear because we don't have a spirit of fear. It's to give you confidence as you see these things happening, you know that it's going to happen. But also that we don't just sit and watch it happen. We arise and shine, and we let the glory of God shine in us and through us, so that because even up to the moment Jesus comes, people are going to be coming to him. And in these last days, there's a great harvest of people coming. So in this dark world, it's more important than ever that we rise and shine.